Good morning. My name is Jim Townsend, and I am the director of the Levin Center at Wayne Law. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's symposium, which we are co-hosting with the Wayne Law Review. Before proceeding further, I want to turn things over to Professor Rick Bierschbach, Dean of Wayne State University Law School, for some opening remarks. Rick?
Thank you very much, Jim, and welcome everybody from Washington, D.C., coming to you from the capital of Oversight and coming to you on an iPhone. So if there are some tech issues, I apologize. But I want to start out by, first of all, thanking an important sponsor of this event, the Cohn Family Endowed Fund. Year after year, this fund supports the Wayne Law Review Symposium, and we're incredibly grateful for this support. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the passing of Judge Avern Cohn recently. He was a great friend to the law school, a big benefactor, and he and his family have really been stalwart supporters, and we appreciate deeply that continued support. I want to thank also our many speakers and panelists who are here today. It's a fantastic lineup. We're honored to have you all here to share your knowledge and expertise on infrastructure investment challenges and opportunities, and how to police investments in infrastructure effectively, which is an incredibly timely topic. I won't get into the details of that because obviously that's what this symposium is about, and there will be a lot more to say about it. But I do want to say a few words about the Levin Center, because in addition to co-sponsoring this symposium, the Levin Center does a bunch of other things. It continues to create high quality programming and learning experiences for our students. And these experiences and the programs allow our students to make connections between the classroom and critical issues in the real world. And so just as a few examples, the Levin Center has been running an internship program for a number of years. With the interns for this summer, the center is going to have sent 30 Wayne Law students to Washington, D.C. to complete internships in congressional oversight committees. And a number of those students have gone on to work on the Hill in the area of oversight. In addition, the center, in combination with our Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights, has launched a new semester-long externship program for students interested in public interest and civil rights. And so Wayne Law students are spending the entire semester working in Washington, D.C., having really fantastic experiences and broadening their horizons in a number of ways. The center also does a bunch of other things really beyond the student-centered aspect of the classroom. So a few things that I think are just incredibly impressive and important for our society and for our government. They've trained over 300 congressional staffers with oversight boot camps. They've trained the EU Parliament's Washington, D.C. office on congressional oversight in a one-day boot camp last year. And I think they've worked virtually with them in Brussels as well. They've launched a new oversight fellowship program that focuses on advancing research and scholarship in this important area. And this is a new program. I think they've had 3 fellows already, and there's going to be more to come in this year's cycle. They've launched a new historical series called Portraits in Oversight, which highlights important historical investigations and oversight personalities and the meaning that these investigations still have today and how they've really changed the course of events in a number of situations. And then they've established a couple of awards: the Carl Levin Award for Effective Oversight, which goes to a member of Congress, usually who is very accomplished in making advances in this area, and a scholarship award, the Levin Center Award for Excellence in Oversight Research, which has highlighted just some fantastic scholars in the last couple of years who are contributing to research and scholarly advancement in this field. So I am incredibly proud of the work that the center is doing. I'm incredibly proud of the community we have here and the opportunities and partnerships like this symposium that it is creating. And I'm grateful to Jim Townsend, the director of the center, and the entire center staff because they work tirelessly to advance the center. And I'm grateful to the center's funders for all they have done to make this important work possible. I do want to hand it back to Jim in a minute, but before I do that, I want to thank a few other people because they've been really instrumental in making this symposium happen. In particular, I want to focus on our law review and thank the symposium editor, Parker Feldman, the editor-in-chief of the law review, Marie Karp, the production editor who I know is working on the written contributions to this, Kate Smigelski, and then just all of the members of the law review. It's not a big staff. It takes a lot of work to pull off a very important and high profile symposium like this. So thank you all. And thank you to the faculty advisor to the law review, Professor Christopher Lund, who I know has also put a lot of time into this. I'm grateful for all your work. And Jim, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for those very kind and generous words. First, let me thank all of you for joining us, all of the people who are with us today virtually for this symposium on oversight, infrastructure, and federalism, which will explore how we can ensure transparency, accountability, and effectiveness with respect to infrastructure investments in the United States. It is certainly an appropriate time to hold such a discussion with the enactment just last November of the historic bipartisan infrastructure bill, which was deemed by a wide range of observers to be the most important step in a generation toward upgrading critical infrastructure in our country. The framers of this law in the White House and in Congress identified a range of goals and made numerous promises in pushing forward this $1 trillion 10-year plan. So I'm going to quote a few things that they said. So here I'm now looking at the White House statement on this, where they said the bipartisan infrastructure law will rebuild America's roads, bridges, and rails, expand access to clean drinking water, ensure every American has access to high-speed internet, tackle the climate crisis, advance environmental justice, and invest in communities that have too often been left behind. They also said the legislation will help ease inflationary pressures and strengthen supply chains by making long overdue improvements to our nation's ports, airports, rail, and roads. And finally, they said it will increase the average number of jobs in this country by something on the order of 1.5 million every year for the next 10 years. Those are a lot of promises, a lot of expectations to meet. The Levin Center's founder and namesake, the late Senator Carl Levin, devoted a good portion of his career to ensuring that the government keeps its promises by championing bipartisan, fact-based oversight to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, and let the public know whether the government is achieving the goals set out in its policies. This means holding government agencies charged with implementing programs and private sector actors awarded taxpayer funds accountable for carrying out their missions according to the law. Our mission at the Levin Center is to expand on Senator Levin's legacy by advancing oversight and strengthening democracy through training, teaching, scholarship, and commentary, to help Americans have confidence that the government that serves them is telling them the truth and delivering on its promises. So we are especially pleased now for the third time in the last 6 years to partner with the Wayne Law Review to bring you a symposium devoted to exploring oversight. In this case, oversight of the nation's investments in infrastructure. This symposium will consist of 2 panel discussions today, the first this morning and the second this afternoon at 2 p.m. There will also be a special, as Rick said, Oversight Symposium edition of the Wayne Law Review, which will be published later this year. That edition will feature more than half dozen scholarly articles by several of our panelists and other nationally recognized experts exploring infrastructure oversight and federalism. I particularly also want to thank Parker Feldman, the symposium editor of the Wayne Law Review, and his colleagues who have put a lot of work making this event and the symposium edition possible. And I want to recognize several members of the Levin Center staff, particularly Margot Lepere, Elise Bean, and Jennifer Celine for their excellent work on this symposium. And I want to thank our panelists and authors for their contributions to the symposium.
We did it.
Finally, I want to mention that on the events section of the Levin Center's website featuring today's event, you have to scroll down to the resources section. You can find a lot of information about scholarship and other expert analysis concerning oversight of infrastructure investment for those who really want to take a deep dive into this topic. Now, to kick off our symposium on oversight of infrastructure, we are honored to share a pre-recorded welcome message from a member of the U.S. Senate who will play a central role in conducting legislative oversight of the implementation of the new infrastructure law. Gary Peters, the junior U.S. Senator from Michigan. Senator Peters serves as chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, affectionately known as HISGAC, which is the lead oversight committee in the Senate. So let's go to that video now.
I'm Senator Gary Peters, and I'm honored to be part of your symposium. I want to thank the Levin Center and the Wayne Law Review for holding this very important discussion. Thanks to the efforts of President Wilson and Senator Levin, who helped bring the Levin Center to Wayne State, we can continue having important dialogues on transparency, accountability, and the effectiveness of our nation's infrastructure investments. As chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, I have long fought to bolster our nation's crumbling infrastructure and deliver on our promise to build back stronger than before. That's why I'm thrilled the bipartisan infrastructure bill is now law. This important legislation is a big victory that will help boost our nation's economic competitiveness and make significant upgrades to our nation's infrastructure. It will allow us to rebuild our roads and bridges and make the largest ever investment in our Great Lakes, and also expand access to clean drinking water and bring high-speed internet to folks all across Michigan and the country, including those who currently lack it. As part of the bill, I was proud to secure $500 million for a loan program that I authored into law that will help communities all across Michigan address severe storms, extreme flooding, and shoreline erosion by providing low-interest loans to help invest in seawalls and barriers and breakers and other resources. These resources will ensure local communities can invest in mitigation and resiliency projects to prevent a disaster from having serious impacts, which saves taxpayers in the long run. In fact, studies have shown that every dollar invested in resilience and mitigation saves taxpayers on average $6 in recovery cost after a disaster. As the critical investments provided by the bipartisan infrastructure bill begin reaching the communities that need them, we must ensure that these important resources are being used responsibly and as Congress intended. Congress has an important responsibility to conduct oversight of these funds and the projects they support to ensure that they are being used effectively and that taxpayers can see their hard-earned dollars being put to good use to build new roads and bridges, upgrade storm drains, replace lead water lines, and so much more. Today's symposium provides a great opportunity to discuss how the federal government can maximize this landmark investment in our infrastructure and work with state and local partners to ensure that Michiganders and all Americans are seeing the benefits of these upgrades. Thank you for inviting me to help kick off today's discussion, and please enjoy the event.
Thank you to Senator Peters and his staff for making that video available to us. Now let me introduce the topic of panel one and our moderator, Beth Osborne. We called this first panel establishing mechanisms for oversight of infrastructure, because we wanted our panelists to explore the challenges of conducting effective oversight in a federal system where much of the funding and authority to build infrastructure comes from the federal government, but where most of the implementation occurs at the state and local levels with private contractors. So we want to get into what kinds of mechanisms exist now for ensuring transparency and accountability with respect to infrastructure spending and programs. What kinds of new mechanisms should be established? And what does the new infrastructure law do to ensure adequate oversight? To help us delve into these and other questions, we have as our panel one moderator, Beth Osborne. Beth is Director of Transportation for America, a national nonprofit committed to a transportation system that connects people to jobs and essential services by all modes of travel, no matter their financial means or physical ability. Beth served as Acting Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where she managed the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program and the Secretary's Livability Initiative, as well as several other programs and strategies. Beth has also worked on Capitol Hill as an advisor to Senator Tom Carper and to Representatives Ron Klink and Brian Baird. Beth is one of the most thoughtful and informed people I know on transportation and infrastructure and their influence on our society. So Beth, we're just thrilled that you're with us today, and please take it away.
Well, thanks so much for having me today, and thanks to the Levin Center and Wayne Law Review, and thanks to Dean Bierbach. It was great to see you and meet you over the Zoom. And I also appreciate, of course, Senator Peters' welcoming remarks. As Jim said, we are going to talk about establishing mechanisms for oversight of infrastructure. And we are going to emphasize the word establishing, because this is not a program that has a great history of major oversight, except in terms of ensuring that the contracting systems used are competitive. In terms of my personal experience with transportation, I grew up in New Orleans and went to school in Baton Rouge. And while I was in Baton Rouge, I needed to get work to help pay my bills, but I couldn't find a job that I could reach without a car. And unfortunately, I already needed help paying my bills. So without a job, I couldn't buy a car. So I couldn't get to work without a car, but couldn't get a car without a job. And I did not grow up poor. And this was a strong influence on me that there was something wrong with our approach to transportation. Now, when I came to DC, I started working on environmental issues and found that transportation was at the heart of so many of our environmental challenges. But somehow there was very little oversight or questioning of how that occurred or how to fix it. When I moved into transportation, I saw firsthand, both from Capitol Hill and DOT, how many promises are made, but how little tracking of spending and managing of the program there was to ensure that those promises were met. At Transportation for America, we have worked on reports, one on the how much money is being spent to repair infrastructure, and the latest data we could get from federal highways was 5 years old. We looked at congestion trends, could not find data collected at the same scope, so found it very hard to analyze what was really happening. And in terms of just measuring the targets that states are setting for themselves within transportation requires you to go through 52 different DOT reports and put it into your own spreadsheet. So we have a long way to go to have real oversight in transportation. Somehow this program gets overwhelming bipartisan support, and maybe it's because we're not looking under the hood. Maybe it's time to. So now we have a historic amount of federal funding going into transportation. Now, not just in terms of funding the infrastructure for the system, but also to electrify vehicles. And there are yet again promises of repair, safety, climate, equity improvements, boost to the economy. But will we get that, and how will we monitor the program to know? And that is what we're going to discuss with our illustrious panel. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists right up front, and then I'm going to turn things over to them to do their presentations. We have Shruti Shah, who is the president and CEO of the Coalition for Integrity, where she is responsible for developing and implementing advocacy campaigns and building strategic partnerships with international organizations, senior government officials, and private sector and nonprofit representatives to ensure that laws against bribery and corrupt practices and favoring transparency are implemented and effectively enforced. She also works with companies and industry associations to compile best practices related to compliance with anti-corruption laws. And she leads the coalition's work in promoting greater transparency and accountability to stem the flow of proceeds of corruption with attention to reforms in the areas of beneficial ownership transparency. In recent years, she's also focused on issues related to federal and state ethics in the United States. We also have a Larry Goldenhirsch, who is a lawyer turned entrepreneur, turned nonprofit leader with 35 years of experience in sustainability and environment. As the Center for Sustainable Energy president, he leads a large team who provide renewable energy program administration and advisory services for both public and private stakeholders to achieve the equitable decarbonization of transportation in the built environment. Prior to being with the center, he founded Enviance, a leading environmental technology company that pioneered the use of the internet to provide environmental management software to industry and government. He started off practicing law in Los Angeles, where he served on Urel and Manella's management committee and specialized in complex commercial litigation. In our conversations, he pointed out that he is a graduate of Duke University, so he's very excited about March Madness and the Sweet 16 results, and we will try to tolerate Duke fanmanship here. And then finally, we have Alex Beckman, who is currently a senior policy advisor for Congressman Chuy Garcia, who represents Illinois' 4th Congressional District. Alex's primary responsibility is handling transportation and infrastructure issues for Congressman Garcia, who is a leading member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Before coming to Capitol Hill, Alex worked at a little outfit called Transportation for America for 3.5 years, where he really worked across the board in transportation issues, but put a ton of time into rail issues and was one of the people who came up with many of the rail programs that were created before this infrastructure bill to establish intercity rail in new places across the country. We're going to start off today with Alex, who is going to give us some context about the history of the program and where we are now.
Thanks, Beth, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I also wanted to thank the Levin Center and the Wayne Law Review for hosting all of us and giving me the honor to speak with you all. As Beth mentioned, my name is Alex Beckman, and I'm a senior policy advisor for Congressman Chuy Garcia of Illinois. He is a member of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and I handle his committee work and generally his transportation and infrastructure issues. I wanted to actually start off today with just some top line takeaways that I hope people take away about the transportation program. This is simplifying things, but at its core, our transportation program is a state-based system. States make all the transportation policy, project, and engineering decisions, and the federal government covers a significant part of those costs. In 2021, it was estimated that the federal government was responsible for about 40% of all the transportation spending in the United States. If you think about it, that's a pretty sweet deal for states. The federal government covers a significant part of those costs, especially for larger projects. So they might cover up to 80 or 90% of a large project like new interstate highway capacity. But the states crucially maintain all the ultimate decisions. So the federal government covers the costs, but the state maintains all the decision flexibility. In addition, there are practically no incentives or disincentives for states to make good decisions with that funding. States get the majority of their federal transportation funding either way, regardless of the outcomes of the spending decisions they make. It doesn't really matter whether a state's decisions result in an improvement or decrease in things like safety, travel time for users of the system, transportation equity, or the environmental sustainability of the system. The state-based approach to our transportation system makes it very hard for the federal government to coordinate project outcomes or advance national goals. For example, if the federal government wanted to reduce climate emissions from the transportation sector, which is a stated goal of the Biden administration, it has to get all 50 states on board. California and Texas have to agree. Michigan and Alabama have to agree. That's not easy to say the least, especially in this political climate. In many ways, if the federal government wants to accomplish certain goals, they have to resort to encouraging or politely asking states to go along with these goals. The federal government does not have a mandate under our system to require those objectives. The complicated nature of our system, as Jim alluded to in his introduction, makes it really hard to do effective federal oversight of federal dollars that go to transportation projects, and makes it really hard to achieve outcomes or goal at the federal level across the United States. Next, I wanted to turn to briefly talking about the historic infrastructure law, the Infrastructure Investment or Jobs Act. First, to state the obvious, but it is still important to say, the IIJA is a massive law, and massive bills are harder to provide effective oversight over. It's not only massive in terms of the total funding, which is $1.2 trillion, but it's also massive in terms of the variety of different types of infrastructure funds. One of the reasons for that is it's actually a combination of two things. It's a combination of the Federal Surface Transportation Reauthorization, which Congress generally does every 5 years, along with additional funding for a variety of types of infrastructure that Congress has not funded at the levels that they do in the IIJA. When it comes to surface transportation, there's really two elements in the IIJA to know about. The first element is funding, as I just mentioned, and it is truly at record levels. The second element, though, is policy, which in many respects is as important as funding. And when it comes to surface transportation policy, the IIJA pretty much keeps the status quo of transportation policy that we've had for the last few surface reauthorizations, with some minor tweaks, like a new program on electric vehicle charging that Larry will talk about. So at least in terms of surface transportation, the IIJA is record investments, but it's also record investments in the status quo. And that has profound consequences, both good and bad, in terms of the results we're likely to see. As Jim alluded to, the IIJA funds not only surface transportation infrastructure like roads, public transit, and passenger rail, but also funds things like broadband, lead pipe removal, drinking water upgrades, electric vehicle charging stations, and much more. There are probably at least a dozen federal agencies that will have a hand in overseeing the rollout of the IIJA funding, not to mention the myriad of state and local entities. There are 3 different federal agencies that are overseeing just the broadband funding alone. That provides a lot of challenges to Congress from an oversight perspective because different committees oversee all these different federal agencies, and that oversight requires a lot of coordination between committees. As someone who staffs a member of Congress that is on 3 committees, I can personally tell you firsthand the challenge it is to get 2 committees to work together, let alone 9 or 10. Next, I would encourage you all to think of our transportation system sort of as a pyramid system with a base and then smaller as you sort of go up. So the base and largest part of our federal transportation system is the Highway Trust Fund, which was created in 1956 by Dwight D. Eisenhower in Congress to fund the creation of interstate highways and generally improved roadways. The Highway Trust Fund is funded in part by federal gas tax and other transportation-related taxes, like an excise tax on the sale of new heavy-duty trucks. The Highway Trust Fund is a mechanism for which the vast majority of federal funded roadway projects, including interstate projects, are funded. That funding flows on a formula basis, which means that every state receives a certain amount of every dollar that goes into the Highway Trust Fund based on a very complicated formula. And in 1983, we did add public transit to the Highway Trust Fund. For the record, I want to make sure people understand this. The gas tax does not currently pay for what we spend on transportation out of the Highway Trust Fund. Since 2008, we have transferred tens of billions of dollars from the U.S. Treasury Department, from general revenue, corporate taxes, income taxes, other revenue sources to pay for this spending. So if someone tells you that the gas tax fully pays for all our highway and transit spending, that is just incorrect. Over the years, we have added many smaller programs over time to the Highway Trust Fund, as members of Congress are interested in continuing funding more things. These programs are things like bicycle and pedestrian improvements, funding for ferries, workforce development, and highway safety. The end result over time is that we have dozens of different transportation programs at the federal level, all with a different purpose. That makes oversight difficult, especially in trying to coordinate outcomes or get holistic results out of these different programs. If I, as a congressional staffer, wanted to see how money was being spent, I would have to contact my local State Department of Transportation. So for example, if I wanted to know why a project in Congressman Garcia's district was chosen or not, I would go to the Illinois Department of Transportation. I would not go to a federal agency. Critically, state departments of transportation maintain maximum discretion in choosing what projects to get to fund with federal dollars. The federal government cannot tell a state DOT what project to fund. And as I alluded to, state departments of transportation get federal transportation dollars no matter the outcome of the projects or policy decisions they make. So again, they're not required to achieve certain outcomes in areas like safety, quality of existing infrastructure, equity, or environmental sustainability. To use an extreme example, a state could decide that they're only going to build new roads. They're not going to maintain existing ones. And the federal government generally couldn't stop the state from doing that. We do have national goals for our transportation system. You go to a specific part of the federal statute, they're there, but they remain that. They're just goals. And perhaps not surprisingly, it's really hard to have accountability when money continues to flow regardless of what outcomes are achieved with that money. The only place where we actually have specific criteria or objectives attached to federal funding for the most part is the discretionary programs that USDOT funds. Discretionary funding means that USDOT will send out a solicitation or notice for application for this funding, and they award it on a competitive basis. So entities have to apply competitively for that funding. In these discretionary programs, we have seen USDOT set specific criteria that they will use to award funding, and they evaluate projects based on that criteria. The difference between how these discretionary federal dollars are awarded and how the Highway Trust Fund formula dollars work could not be starker. And from my personal experience, we get much better outcomes through those discretionary programs than the Highway Trust Fund dollars because we get better projects through the discretionary programs. Not surprisingly, when projects have to compete, we get better projects. The last thing I wanted to end on is just reemphasizing the impact of choices. At the end of the day, states and some larger municipalities will choose what projects to fund with the transportation money from the IIJ law. Like anything involving money, it's a policy choice on what we end up spending that money on. And let's not forget that we have control over those choices. Our transportation system faces many challenges today. Over 40,000 people die in traffic crashes on our roadways every year. And sadly, that number has only gone up in the past few years. Transportation is the sector with the most greenhouse gas emissions in the US. We recently surpassed the power sector, and that number actually is only increasing. And finally, as Beth alluded to from her story, we provide inadequate transportation options, especially for lower income individuals who can't afford a car. Our last 100 years of policy decisions have led us to a very auto-centric transportation system, with a car being the only option that the vast majority of people have to get around. Because IIJ has continues the status quo policy, this situation is likely to remain the same. Now, our system has benefited a lot of great people, and Michigan and Detroit definitely speak to some of the prosperity that is created, the Motor City, being a prime example. But as I alluded to, there are challenges, and we can choose to choose a different path. Other countries like the Netherlands, which used to have an auto-centric system like the US, have shifted and started to make much more investments in things like bike infrastructure and public transit, and thereby have provided much more transportation options to their residents. We can copy those choices and make the same decisions that other countries have if we want to. That is up to us and the policy decisions we choose to make. That concludes my presentation, and I turn it back to you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm going to turn things over to Larry.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Levin Center and Wayne State Law for convening this important session, and thank you for people out in television land on Zoom. I'm Larry Goldenhirsch. As Beth said, I'm the president of the Center for Sustainable Energy. Next slide, please. The Center for Sustainable Energy is a 501c3 nonprofit. We have about $220 million of annual revenue. We employ about 240 people. And unlike many nonprofits, we have no members, we have no donors, we have no shareholders, we pay no dividends. We fund 100% of what we do by providing service for value under contract that we go into the market and bid for and hopefully win. And so the service that CSE is expert in providing is the data-driven design and administration of large-scale market transformation incentive programs. So incentive programs for electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, solar, storage, load shaping, load demand management, and things like that in the renewable energy sector. As the slide shows here, we manage, it says about $1 billion, we manage about $1.5 billion of incentive programming designed to drive the adoption of electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And on the built environment side, another $1 billion or $1.5 billion of programs designed to incentivize the installation of solar and storage and other techniques to control demand on the grid. In the electric vehicle space, and I'm going to spend my time today talking about the very exciting $5 billion going to formula funds going into electric vehicle charging infrastructure and the $2.5 billion going into electric vehicle charging infrastructure, hydrogen, propane, and other things. We touch 30% of 100% of all new EV car buyers. And could I see the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, so this is sort of representative of our involvement across the country. In our electric vehicle and electric vehicle infrastructure programs, we touch about 80 million Americans, and all of the circles. This is a busy slide, but we have a lot of programs that we manage, including 7 statewide programs on both coasts, nothing yet in the middle in terms of a statewide program. And we bring to this conference, I hope, kind of the Home Depot department of renewable energy. We go out and do this stuff. And so we are experienced in, for example, putting to work $500 million of investment being made for the purpose of deploying electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the state of California. We have other charging programs across the country as well. And so what I've been asked to do today is to talk about guidelines for how to limit, as it was said in the beginning, waste, fraud, and abuse. Next slide, please. So to do that, I'm going to frame the subject matter that I want to talk about today. And it basically is the funding, and there are 2 buckets of funding that Congress has appropriated to fund the build out of what I call the 4th dimension of transportation, which is the electrification of the existing infrastructure so that we can bring the country from a light duty vehicle perspective and maybe even medium duty, heavy duty, from fossil fuel to an electrified propulsion system that we think would, and I think science shows would be a tremendous advantage for the climate. So there are 2 buckets in the IIJA that directly fund the installation, the planning and the installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The first is the formula fund, and Alex talked about formula funds as the base for the way the federal government gives money to the states to do things. In the case of electric vehicle charging, there is $5 billion being made available to the states on a formula basis. To qualify for this money, the states must submit a charging implementation plan, electric vehicle charging implementation plan, by August 1, 2022, which in theory will be approved by the Federal Highway Administration 60 days later, September 30, 2022. That will unlock the first tranche of money that's flowing to the states. The bottom bullet on this slide shows that that's $1 billion. The plans that are to be submitted by the states are supposed to focus on the alternative fuel corridors, more specifically what most people call the interstates. This funding is intended to fund 80% of 100% of the installation cost for this electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Some of these stations, by the way, can cost $350,000, $400,000. It has a lot of requirements. The planning has a lot of requirements in it for the states. Some states are familiar with electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging. Other states have almost none of it. So really, from the passage of this act to August 1, when states are supposed to submit a plan, some states really need to only describe what they plan to do, and they've planned it for a while. Others need to learn about electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and then submit a plan. So that's the first bucket. The second bucket is discretionary grant programs. That's $2.5 billion. That can be 50% of that is reserved for priority rural, low and moderate income communities and tribal communities. It's not so prescriptive about having to go on the interstates. It is more of an experimental program. And Alex and I are going to talk about, when we get to talking about whether discretionary or formula is a good idea for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So we're just going to put a pin in that for now. So how does Congress and the US government at large do its job to ensure that the $7.5 billion dedicated to the investment in electric vehicle charging infrastructure and alternative fuel charging infrastructure? What do the overseers do to determine whether there is fraud, waste, abuse, or whether things are actually happening? So in this space, I would submit to this audience that we have technology that takes us away from the backwards looking report and correct into forward looking monitor and assure. And so the next slide, please. So we've identified and we have been putting in electric vehicle charging infrastructure for years, and for a decade been dealing with electric vehicles. So we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. We've been part of all of those things, and we bear the sort of the scars to show it. But there are 4 basic buckets of oversight that I would recommend, that we would recommend that the federal government undertake to assure that the taxpayer dollars are well spent for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And this investment is not simply building what exists today. It is not the status quo. This investment drives a tectonic shift, a climate-saving tectonic shift in the way light-duty vehicles operate here in this country. So this is very, very important. This is our chance. So what should the government do? First, in the planning phase. So as I said, on August 1, the states are required to submit plans. Kind of basic. The plans ought to forecast how many EVs are going to be in the state. How can you decide where infrastructure should go if you don't know how many vehicles are coming your way? The plan should evidence an understanding of how electric vehicle charging infrastructure works. How many chargers do you need how many vehicles can be handled by one charger? Where should they be? How do they interoperate? The states need to demonstrate that knowledge to the federal government. If they're not telling the federal government how many vehicles are going to be in the state, and they're not telling the federal government or evidencing an understanding of how charging works, that period from August 1 to September 30 should be pretty rough for the states. To go back and figure it out. Ought to reflect priorities for rural, tribal, and disadvantaged communities. That's in the Infrastructure Investment Act. How do you do that? Basically, there's technology available today, GIS technology, readily available. States can engage, if they don't have already, where they can actually visually see carve-outs for rural, tribal, disadvantaged areas of EV intensity. All of these things are in the center of the channel of technology for planning today. I would hope the federal government in its oversight is looking for the deployment of center of the channel technology, nothing innovative. We're not trying to land anything on the moon here, to make sure that the plans that submitted reflect an understanding of the fleets that are coming, how the chargers operate, and some geospatial understanding of tribal, rural, Justice 40 related initiatives. That's the planning phase. Now the states need to go in and implement. And as Alex said, federal government can't directly control how the states do this, except in the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act and the portion that I'm discussing. Congress had the wisdom to identify the potential for a qualified product list, meaning the federal government is only going to pay for technology that meets a certain spec. This is very standard industry practice. We are not talking about rocket science here. What should the oversight do? Congress should ask Secretary Buttigieg and Secretary Granholm, where are the specifications the states are supposed to follow? And what process is being done to confirm that this qualified product list is being deployed so that federal dollars are paying for systems that work? Okay. Another thing in the implementation that should happen is including collaboration with the utilities, because the utilities need to provide the power. There needs to be an implementation plan, not just putting a piece of equipment in the ground, but making sure that the electrons can get there in a qualified way. Networking, there's software that connects all of these chargers, very important. And this last bullet is something I'm really focused on. I hope that the contracts and the funding is contingent on obligating, not asking for, obligating the transference of the data from these systems. We live in a technologically advanced world. Again, this is center of the channel technology. There's technology that exists that will allow the federal government to understand every single session of every single charger in the country and aggregate this stuff into a data warehouse where several things could happen. First of all, the government can understand, yes, there is the achieved uptime along the interstate corridors and can actually see where uptime falls off. And I'm not describing something that needs to get invented. This is something that exists today. Okay, so uptime. In addition to uptime, the session data that comes from these systems is critical to understand the one thing that will make this 10-year investment successful, and that is understanding how the consumer uses charging. We call it a charger profile. If you understand that the American consumer uses a DC fast charge for 6 minutes in the following way in Colorado, and it's very different from the way they use it in Alabama, then when the states go to design years 2, 3, 4, and 5 of this $5 billion formula investment, they can inform those decisions with the way consumers actually use the technology and with the evolution of the technology, so that the infrastructure that gets built 5 years from today will be far more informed and better serve the people than the infrastructure that gets built today, because the technology is evolving, consumer understanding is evolving, and the very obvious, I wouldn't call it a secret, the solution is make sure you get the data. Make sure the data is stored in something we call a data warehouse, where the data can be turned into knowledge, user profiles, uptime. These are obligations that I think the federal government has. What the government does not have is the opportunity to make the excuse that the technology is unavailable or that we couldn't do it. This is not 1956 when President Eisenhower began to design the highway system. We have technology, it's used routinely in industry, and I think the government fails if it doesn't use it to manage the rollout of this $5 billion. And finally, I would say, and so I'm going to mention data again, by the way, in the paper that we have, which is on the site, we identify the data construct that we're using in California with the California Energy Commission, that 10 years of experience tells us is adequate to manage this stuff. I would hope that that construct, which we've submitted in comments, gets embraced by the joint office, the operating entity between the DOE and the DOT, and they use it. And throughout the paper that's attached to the symposium materials, we basically list things that we think would be important for oversight, because they are things that we have seen over the last decade work and not work. And our goal is to make sure this $5 billion and the 7.5 total gets deployed correctly. The last time we went at this at the federal government level, no O&M. You can't put equipment in that requires maintenance without actually maintaining the equipment. Again, technology would tell you when a system is down. When a system is down, there should be workflow to send an engineer out to go fix it. But O&M, the NEVI statute, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act does talk about a 5-year O&M plan. It's an opportunity to do major workforce development. There are training programs for electricians. This is a major opportunity to stand up an O&M force around the country to make sure that the $7.5 billion that does get invested is working in 5 years. And with that, I think I'll pass the baton to the next presenter. Thank you.
That's sure thing.
So thank you very much, and really thank you to the Wayne Law Review and to the Levin Center for inviting all of us, and really thank you to Beth for the very, very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for attending. So as Beth mentioned, I'm the CEO of Coalition for Integrity, and Coalition for Integrity is a nonprofit. We are based in Washington, DC, and we work really to reduce corruption and increase transparency in the public and private sector. By way of background, I'm a CPA, and I'm also a certified fraud examiner. So prior to joining the nonprofit world, I spent all my life in the private sector investigating cases of fraud and corruption. So obviously a topic which talks about fraud, waste, and abuse really appeals to me. Now, as Alex has mentioned, and as Beth mentioned, and Jim mentioned really in his opening remarks, that infrastructure, if done well, really brings a lot of benefits to society: job creation, access to better utilities, really safer roads and bridges. But infrastructure projects, really the mega projects that we are talking about, are inherently complex, large, and really unique. And as a result of this, it is very easy to inflate invoices, conceal bribes, and really misappropriate funds. And all of these infrastructure projects really have complex transaction chains, and they have multiple subcontractors. So it makes it really hard to monitor them. Now, internationally, people believe, and many experts have commented on that they believe that infrastructure projects internationally have a 10 to 30% rate of fraud in terms of spending, which is a really large amount. When you talk to former inspector generals in the US, they say most federal programs in the US have a 5 to 10% rate of fraud. Now, 5 to 10% of $1 trillion is a very, very large amount. And certainly we hope to reduce that rate. So my organization, Coalition for Integrity, released a report called Oversight of Infrastructure Spending in about September last year, when there were discussions going on about really this infrastructure bill. And really, we looked at past domestic infrastructure projects in the US. So we looked at projects like the Big Dig. We looked at energy performance saving contracts like this Schneider Electric case, where contracts were obtained through bribes and kickbacks. We looked at a fiber optic expansion project called BBU Optinet in Southwest Virginia, which again was marred by evasion of employment taxes, really violation of state and local conflicts of interest rules, and really very, very many other things. And we also looked at projects like the California high-speed rail expansion project, which again, the lack of transparency, the conflicts of interest, and really the lack of adequate supervision there have cost the taxpayers billions, and that project has been indefinitely expanded. We've also looked at reports by the Government Accountability Office. We've looked at really reports by former inspector generals, and we've looked at oversight done by the Recovery Board in coming up with our recommendations. And I'm going to try and give a couple of our high-level recommendations, and they touch not only on federal oversight, but also state oversight as well. And to be honest, like a couple of them can be actually done during the implementation of the project, but some of them may require some congressional action, which I think would be valid. And I'm going to start talking about one of the points that actually both Beth and Larry had kind of alluded to. I mean, they actually make up the first and second of my points. One is we do think that there should be a public website which tracks infrastructure spending. And this is not really a new thing. When the Recovery Act was passed, there was recovery.gov. The CARES Act also has this Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, which has this website which tracks really the pandemic spending. Of course, that is out of date. And as Beth mentioned, that is the case with a lot of things. But a public website serves many purposes. It helps us hold our officials accountable. It gives disappointed bidders insight into bidding outcomes. It also helps those like journalists with an incentive to spot fraud and corruption access to information. And I understand that some agencies may have information with regard to implementation of grants, but a public website will actually improve the usefulness of information which is already publicly available, but is fragmented and very difficult to access. So that's one thing. The second thing I'd like to emphasize is the importance of community involvement and consultations with community. And of course, that has to be done at the state and local level. At really hearings which relate to what I would say the cost and the timeline and really the design of the project, it would be important to have informed discourse and debate, get really involvement of the community and explain the rationale for the project. This will also help with keeping contractors and those responsible for implementation of the project really more accountable. And I would also say that it might surface problems like litigation and stuff, which would happen at a later point, which could happen at a later point in the project. Finally, I'd also want to say I'm really disappointed that the infrastructure bill does not provide for coordinated oversight. Like, it does not provide for funding for a committee of inspector generals. We've seen that in the recovery board in that 2009 stimulus. We definitely saw the pandemic response accountability committee set up for the CARES Act. Again, I would like to say maybe since many of the inspector generals in PRAC are already going to be involved in infrastructure oversight, PRAC's mandate should be extended, given more funding. They have acquired certain data analytic capabilities, which will be lost if they are completely disbanded. Again, money spent in oversight is never wasted. I'm looking at a 2020 report by the Council of Inspector Generals for Integrity and Efficiency. And they said in 2020, federal inspector generals had a budget of $3.8 billion. And they basically they uncovered savings of $53 billion, which is a return of $17 for every dollar spent on oversight. I mean, so just that almost makes my point. Also on the federal side, I am again disappointed that the bill does not specifically talk about whistleblower protection. I'm reading reports that Senator Grassley tried to put that amendment in, but for some reason it wasn't included in the final bill. Again, there should obviously have been strong provisions for both the protection of whistleblowers against retaliation, but also for anonymity of those whistleblowers. Nevertheless, I think Inspector General should be following best practices laid out by SIGI, laid out by whistleblower protection coordinators, and that's, again, very important point. Again, there are so many other points I could make on the federal side, but on the state side, I want to say that state oversight is obviously incredibly important. Both Alex and Beth have pointed out that implementation happens at the state level. I'm heartened by reports when I see that certain legislators like Minnesota are actually going to hold quarterly hearings and require quarterly reporting. I also know that some states have appointed infrastructure czars to coordinate infrastructure spending, again, a very good sign. Some auditor offices at the state level, like Washington, they've asked for an expansion of budget. I think Washington State Auditor's Office have asked for an expansion of 1.6 million, and they've asked for 10 additional people, and they've said even with that, they'll barely be able to keep up. These auditors' offices are obviously not well funded. And again, the bill does not obviously make any allocation specifically for state oversight, which would have been helpful. In addition to additional funding, I think that at the state level, there are certain other things that can be done. For example, state officials involved in infrastructure should have to make conflict of interest declarations, either with the Secretary of the State or the State Ethics Office. Separately, I think that even others downstream, like contractors and subcontractors, should be making these conflict of interest declarations as well. I know that Beth mentioned that there is obviously some language in the bill to encourage competitive bidding with no guidance on what competitive bidding should be. The federal acquisitions rules obviously have some guidance. I know that many countries have outside participants in the bidding process, outside monitors in the bidding process. Like, for example, Australia has what they call probity officers, which participate in the procurement discussion and investigate any concerns that arise. Now, that adds credibility to the entire process. Again, I think that's a suggestion we should look at. And I think state officials should be provided some training on cost estimation and project planning so that they can actually understand and evaluate bids and make competitive selections. And I obviously want to make a case for upfront risk assessment and also early auditing and communicating the results early on. This has been done before in the Recovery Act when, say, one example I have is the city of Denver. When they were monitoring compliance with the Recovery Act, they had a tiered notification system. So when issues arose, they could actually, in an informal way, reach out to the agency that was responsible. And then say if nothing was done, then they had a more formal notification process going on. Again, so early auditing will actually help you course correct earlier if you communicate the results earlier. So lots of other recommendations, lots of case studies in our report. So please do look it up. It's on our website, www.coalitionforintegrity.gov. I think Margot may have a copy of the resource. If not, we'll send you guys a link. But with that, I'm going to pause and end and turn it over to Beth.
Wonderful. Now we get to dig in. I have a question that actually I was planning on discussing, and then Larry raised it in his presentation, which is the difference between funding going out through a formula program, whereby the amount of money goes out by a predetermined formula, usually by Congress, sometimes by the agency, and goes out kind of on an automatic way, versus a competitive grant program whereby folks apply for funding and make the case that their project is the best project. So if each one of you could take a moment and talk about what is the comparative value of each approach and what are the different needs and challenges and oversight of each, I'd appreciate it. And I'll give Shruti a chance to take a breath since she just finished. And I'll start with Larry, since you're the one who raised it in your own presentation.
All right, thanks. I would say, I understand why Alex feels that competitive grants, the market might yield better projects for the federal government to fund than sort of a formula. In the case of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, I would say that Congress is elected to be more prescriptive in the formula funding than they have in the competitive grants. And because the electric vehicle charging infrastructure is new, and for many states brand new, the basic requirements in the formula funding, the need for data collection, the need for a plan, the need for understanding what you're actually building and what your goals are, I think is going to be a far more powerful mechanism for progress, because the 2.5 billion that's competitive, they don't really have the guideposts on data. It's hard to assess the result. And my fear is, without those very easy to obtain insights, these programs and investments may not yield the benefit that the formula funds programmatically putting charging across all the interstates and the state national highway system will yield. And we're in an early phase of rollout at scale. So it's really not a time for experimentation in light duty, in my opinion.
Alex, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I think maybe actually to Larry's surprise, I'm going to agree with him from a certain perspective on this. I think the question is maybe less formula versus competitive and more, are there set goals and outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And so the problem, as I was alluding to with the basic highway trust formula program, is there not really any goals that states have to meet or some national goal that we're going to do. And so I actually think that the electric vehicle charging program is actually a sign where Congress may have gotten it right by saying, hey, states are going to spend the money, but they have to report back with a plan and set goals. And so I think that's the one of the points I hope folks take away with is, the successes we've seen in transportation interstate system in 1956, and hopefully, this electric vehicle charging system, we have an overall goal that the federal government says we're going to meet. And, states may be able to, sort of help do that because they're in their state and can spend the money more effectively. But we set that goal, we have a plan, we have metrics they're going to meet, and the states have to meet that goal in using that funds. In the highway trust formula, when it comes to road and highway funding, we have none of those goals. There's no overarching goal that we're trying to build that funding towards. And I think that's the fundamental problem. So my point about competitive, at least for the base highway trust fund formula, is DOT actually sets goals and objectives that, when applicants apply, they have to meet. And so I think for the base highway trust formula, just the way things have worked out, I think that's why we've seen better projects on the competitive side. But to Larry's point, if the goals that we're setting are through the formula funding and we have a more nebulous competitive program on the electric vehicle charging, in that instance, the formula funding may work out better. But it's really, really important that we set goals and that whether it's state, localities, whoever's spending the money, meet that goals and we track and hold them accountable.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I've gotten a chance to read all these programs, and I was struck by how much tighter the rules were, the approach was for the EV program as opposed to building massive highways. That program is, here's some money, you can do anything to do with highways with it. And that may just show a little bit of the difference between how you create a good formula program. Shruti, what are the challenges when you are dealing with a competitive grant program versus a formula grant program in terms of auditing them? And how do you set each up well to make sure we're getting the best bang for our buck?
So, Beth, first of all, you ask the most complicated questions, and then you're like, answer them in a concise 2-minute.
2, 3 minutes, go.
First of all, I agree with what Alex has said, and to be honest, we are more concerned about preventing fraud, waste, and abuse. So I'm indifferent as to whether it's formula driven or whether really there's a competitive process. I mean, our basic points are about transparency and the points that I've raised before, but also about the fact that I don't see in the US this sort of project evaluation that you do. Have we met the goals? Because, when you're doing regular auditing and all of that, it's not just about tracking the flow of money. It's also figuring out in terms of each project, what the goals were, have those goals been met? I hate for it to sound like an end of the project postmortem, because it really should be done continually along the project so that you can course correct really when things go wrong. And I think those are some of the kinds of things, obviously increased transparency throughout, sharing of information, but really that kind of upfront risk assessment, the actual conducting project evaluations, the tracking of money, setting up strong whistleblower programs, all of those are crucially important. It doesn't matter which way you decide to spend your money. I mean, those are the things that are important. And also funding oversight. I mean, at the state level, I don't know how these auditors' offices are going to be set up to manage this inflow of money, because they are looking at the entire life cycle. Like, what happens when a state gets the money? How are the projects selected? Like how, who decides which contractors, and how is it decided which contractors really get the grants? And then are they, basically, are they achieving the implementation goals, both in terms of spending and other things? What's happening? All of those things, it's going to be tough. I'm really worried about the attention being paid to oversight, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level, just because the lack of funding.
Yeah, I think when funding gets tight, particularly at departments of transportation, one of the things that we find is they cut the planners and the oversight and things like that first, and that does create great challenges. Alex, we have a question. You mentioned how the fragmentary nature of infrastructure spending makes oversight difficult. Could you go into more depth over how you think relevant stakeholders can or should make oversight more streamlined?
Sure, it's a great question, Beth. So states they actually report how they're going to spend the money to US DOT or federal highways. So there are these things called state transportation improvement plans, which list out, they cover 5 years, and they sort of list out how the state's going to spend money. So you can go and see a project name and a brief description. The problem is it doesn't really give you a holistic understanding of like what the outcomes are going to be, why the state chose a project. It literally is just a list of what the state is going to decide to spend its money on. So I think the thing I think where we should start is what we tried to do a little bit in 2012 around what are called performance measures. So in 2012, we passed a service reauthorization, the MAP 21 service reauthorization, and said, hey, let's have states measure, their performance across a bunch of categories, conditions of roads, condition of bridges. There was an attempt by the Obama administration to do a greenhouse gas reporting measure in 2016. So I think where we need to start is having states report more concrete, objective performance measures to DOT, so we can sort of understand, hey, how many bridges need to be fixed? Has the condition of your pavement on your roadways increased or not? And sort of try to tie the funding that we're spending to actually performance measures. This is done in businesses throughout multiple industries, and transportation is actually one of the few that don't do sort of any objective-based performance reporting. So I think the first thing is we need more concrete data from states to the federal government about actually what are we trying to achieve? What is the state of our infrastructure? And then from there, I think that's where we need to start tying some of the infrastructure spending that states are doing to improvement across these important metrics.
Excellent. And I can also say that, we have really struggled as one of those organizations and stakeholders that tries to do that oversight and really see where the money's going and what objectives we're getting or not getting. And so, yeah, I think that I endorse everything that Alex said. Shruti, one question we have from the audience is you discussed how you thought public infrastructure spending should be more readily accessible, instead of what my organization's having to do with the performance management site at Federal Highways right now, which is go through 52 different PDF documents, pull all the targets out and put them into a spreadsheet. Talk to us about, in more detail, about the current state of online infrastructure spending data and how you think it could be improved.
Current state is exactly what you said, that some agencies have some reports on project implementation. Those reports are many times out of date. So it is common to see things which are 90 days out of date. And you're nodding, so I know you understand that. But in terms of the current infrastructure bill, Alex just mentioned a point that the states have to provide reports. And certainly the federal agencies are also required to provide Congress with reports on implementation of grants. I feel there should be more robust reporting requirements really from the funding recipients as well. So if you actually require reporting down the chain, and then basically when recipients of infrastructure funds are required to file quarterly reports and in a machine readable format, agencies can then put them on their website, right? A public facing website. But that doesn't really answer what I had said. Like there actually should be a public website to track all spending. It really shouldn't be agency by agency. We really should look at what was done under the recovery.gov and really even what the CARES Act Pandemic Response Accountability Committee is doing through their website, so that you can actually go from that top level 1.2 trillion and then track down, right down to who's actually receiving the funding. And there have been places where you actually see this information is useful, not just to groups such as, Beth, your group, but we also see reporters making use of that information. When the CARES Act came out, there was a lot of pushback on making public the recipients of the PPP loans. And then finally, the administration decided to make that public. And boy, did that uncover a lot of fraud. I mean, we had so many reporters and investigative journalists writing reports on how this company, which didn't exist before, the day before the PPP loan was out, suddenly got this PPP funding, how these people have then spent money on buying Lamborghinis and expensive cars rather than using it on really their employees. So I would say that you have to actually ask for information from funding recipients. But again, agencies also have to be better about data collection. You can't have a public website if the information that you get from agencies yourself, like agencies, is out of date and it's not in a machine readable format. So you can't make many cuts of data. You can't do any analysis. I mean, PDF reports, oh my gosh, absolutely not.
Yes, I am so with you. All right, I'm going to move to Larry. Larry, you brought up something in your presentation. You went through in some pretty good detail what we want to see in the formation of this new program to create EV charging systems. One of the things you mentioned, which really struck me, was the need for an operations and maintenance plan. Maintenance has not been something we have been very good at in any infrastructure program. We hear report after report about this kind of sorry state of our water infrastructure. We build it. Sometimes we built it 100 years ago, and that was about it. And we do not refurbish, maintain. That's not as fun. Definitely the case on our highways and also in our transit system. So talk to me about what we should do here to ensure we don't make the mistakes of those other programs and we have a working system that helps deploy electric vehicles quickly and on an ongoing basis.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Just to step back, I'm going to answer the question through a simplified perspective. I am assuming that what the federal government did with its 7.5 billion, at least for the 5 billion, it says, we want to buy and deploy 500,000 pieces of equipment called electric vehicle chargers, and we want them to work. An equipment purchase, okay? Yes, it's infrastructure, it's an equipment purchase. So there are systems that have been running for years called computerized maintenance management systems and SCADA systems and systems that routinely collect data and ask equipment electronically, are you working or not? So the simple answer here is it's 500,000 chargers. If the federal government can find a way to require the people who deploy the charging equipment to send session data, operating data to a data warehouse, there are systems that will tell all the taxpayers whether these things are working or not, uptime or not. There are systems you can bolt onto this and say that when it's not working, there's a workflow. Get the engineer out and fix it. So this is center of the channel. This is the thing that industry has been using for 10 years to reduce cost and improve efficiency. I would think it would be inexcusable for the federal government not to mandate the collection of the data, enforce the mandate with real lawyers who can sue people and take money away. Put the data in a data warehouse that all of us in the technology industry have been using for 10 years and connect it to data-driven workflows so that you can actually achieve the maintenance that's done routinely by companies in the for-profit sector, probably since, for the last 10 years. So none of this is extraordinary moonshot stuff. And I think it would be inexcusable for the federal government not to follow the practice of industry here. Not optional, inexcusable.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Unfortunately, that's what we do in so many of our infrastructure programs.
But why? Alex pointed out that, and I didn't realize this because I have not been involved like the rest of you in all of these programs. We were heavily involved in discussing the important requirements for infrastructure around electric vehicle charging for this bill. I just assumed they all were like this, but Alex is right. We're going out and buying 500,000 chargers. They better work for 5 years. It's real simple. So, and there's data that can tell us if it works or not. So make sure it's a qualified product list, make sure it's connected. And when the data comes in, if it's not working, make sure you fix it. And if you don't, the DOJ is going to call you, say, we got a problem. I mean, why is that hard? I guess I would ask the professionals why is that? As a taxpayer and as someone who's run multiple businesses, it's mystifying that is difficult. Mystifying.
Alex, you want to take a run at that?
Sure, and I think this answers one of the audience questions I saw. So the analogy I'll use here is imagine for the last 66 years, which is basically since 1956, someone gave you 40%, like you spent money on whatever food you wanted to buy, and someone picked up 40% of the cost. And they didn't require you to spend, you could choose whatever. There was no requirements. They didn't require you to buy, certain types of vegetables or fruits. You could literally buy anything. And all of a sudden that person is like, you know what, actually, we've been giving you less money. We actually now want to put in requirements. We want you to buy a certain amount of vegetables each week. Or we want to make sure that, you lose weight based on the food you're purchasing. But you, for the last 66 years, have had carte blanche to do whatever. And that's basically the deal that states have had on the highway side in particular. They have gotten funding for the last 66 years. They choose whatever projects they want. They're not required, as I said, to meet certain outcomes. And so I think the challenge has become, and we tried in the House of Representatives this past time with a pretty transformative bill to put in some of those basic requirements, as Larry, you're alluding to, that are common sense that businesses use in every single sector. maintain what you have first before you buy new stuff. Make sure it lasts. Have, performance benchmarks that you have to meet. Like, this is not rocket science. This is standard practice in, businesses. And we don't do it in the transportation
Not
industry.
popular.
Right. It's not popular among states that have this sweet deal of they get 40, and for the big projects, it's minimum of 80% of the cost covered by the federal government. And so the problem is when you try to change that sweet system, even with basic things like a guidance memo saying, hey, we'd love for you to think about doing these things, states freak out and say, hey, that's infringing on our ability to do it. And so I think that's why Beth and I are
Alex, I just want to point out,
Go
they freaked out about an unenforceable memo suggesting that they might consider repairing their infrastructure before building new stuff that they can't afford to maintain. An unenforceable memo caused a what? Now a 4-week
at least, I
controversy? Yeah.
Yeah, more than that. So Larry, I think that's why Beth and I have been so pleasantly surprised that in the EV charging system, we have put in these, in the formula, funding in particular, we have put in these requirements, because Larry, as you were alluding to, things like basic O&M requirement maintenance, or data, that stuff does not exist in most of the rest of the system. And so my hope would be that we take the good policy that we've done on the EV charging side, make sure that actually happens, but to replicate that. And as I was, saying earlier, the most successful thing that we've done in transportation is the interstate highway system. And the reason that worked is because we had a national goal. We're going to connect the entire country. And we were able to figure out how to do that. The problem is, as Beth was saying, all this road funding, which is like, $45 billion a year, there's no large goal that we're working towards. It's just spend the money. And so I think that's why I'm more optimistic about the EV charging, is because we have a concrete goal of we want to have a network of accessible, interoperable, well-maintained EV charging stations. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons coming out of the IIJ is the more you set, concrete goals, everyone should have access to broadband. Let's remove all the lead pipes and actually enforce those. That's where you get successful. And I think the lack of basic setting goals and objectives for the highway and road spending is why we've had so many problems over the last 6 years.
Beth, can I ask Alex a question from panelist to panelist? First of all, I love what you just said. And like I said, I didn't realize that all these transportation bills didn't have some level of prescription in them. Now that you have it in the infrastructure, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, so you're free to say, I don't know. Now that you have something in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, at least with respect to EV infrastructure, prescription, like this needs to happen. How does Congress make sure that the executive branch does that? Like, I'll take 2 examples: qualified product list, data coming into a warehouse. I know I keep beating the drum because it's the only thing I've got, but how do you do that from your perch and from your colleagues across in the Senate? How does that happen? So we don't wake up in 2 years or 5 years in another one of these seminars saying, oh, if we'd only done that. Now it's just like bridges. We didn't check on it. Now we got weeds growing out of all these things. We wasted $5 billion. How does it happen now?
It's a great question. So I think, Congress has to pay close attention, right? So you want to have good agency staff, but Congress also needs to be engaged. And then frankly, I think it's folks like yourself that, come to DC and say, here are the issues, or here's what they're doing right, and here's what they're doing wrong. In some ways, I've mentioned to Beth the irony all the time. As a congressional staffer, you're supposed to have access to the most information in the world. But in some ways, you actually find it out last because you don't have the time to pay attention to it, as much as folks do. So we rely on folks like you, Larry, to come and say, hey, Department of Energy is doing this correctly, or they're not doing this correctly, right? And so I think that's where, the conversations you all have with us about what is going right, what is going wrong. That way we can, sort of get to the bottom of it with the federal agencies. So it's about keeping the pressure up, encouraging Congress to have strong oversight of DOE, DOT, and it's sort of, getting advocacy groups, nonprofits, the business community to sort of form a coalition to keep trying to implementing the law in the way that it's supposed to be.
And I will jump in because we only have 5 minutes left and I want to get a final question in. I will add, I think that the trust fund is a big problem. We don't revisit these programs every year, which makes annual and constant oversight very challenging. In transportation, we revisit these issues every 5 to 7 years. And that is very convenient for those who get the money, but it does make the pressure to do regular oversight a little harder. Bringing this back to, the fundamental issue here, which is, what are we going to get from all this spending? Every time we pass a transportation bill, we are promised that infrastructure is going to be repaired, that people are going to be able to reach their needs more efficiently, that safety will be improved, and the economy will be bettered. But after every bill expires, we tend to go back to those needs as an excuse to put more money in, as if we have made no progress. And in many cases, we haven't made much progress. Sometimes the failure to make progress is the reason for more money. With this historic investment, what do we need to do to monitor? What does the federal government in particular, both the agencies and Congress, need to do to monitor these programs to see that we do better in the implementation and we actually reach the goals that are continuously promised? And who wants to volunteer to take that one first? Shruti, I saw you come off of mute.
So I'm going to attempt and certainly would love to hear from Alex, and I almost know what Larry's going to say about data now. That point I agree with, absolutely. Particularly the point about making data-driven decisions. So I would say, first of all, Congress does need to exercise its regular oversight, right? Have regular meetings and really be asking for reports from agencies and all of that. And that is just part of the regular oversight role of Congress. But certainly they have to look at the money spent on oversight and whether there is a coordinating committee of inspector generals needed and whether they should expand track the pandemic response accountabilities committee's mandate to oversee these funds. All of that is also important, but there are other things as well. I mean, agencies also should be empowered to really what I would say, terminate infrastructure funding and seek reimbursements when, things go wrong. I've seen in at least a couple of the projects that we've looked at, case studies that we've looked at in our report, both the Schneider Electric power saving one and that BVU Optinet, which I mentioned, which was the fiber optic expansion project in Southwest Virginia, again, related to getting high-speed internet for rural areas. There were basically the CEO lied on bidding documents. There were false statements made, and agencies did not actually seek any reimbursement in those cases. So things like that also would actually help. I mean, those are things in the contractual terms and stuff, and I do know that they are there, but also empowering law enforcement, setting up interagency task force. Ultimately, I have found that when you have spending and fraud occurs, you only ever get to a small piece of the fraud. And then when you talk about recovery, actually getting the money back, it's almost like an inverted triangle, like the money spent at the top and really the fraud that you spot is like, again, a smaller piece of that. Hopefully there is not that much fraud, but undoubtedly there will be. And then the money you recover is really only a fraction. So that is one of the things. And again, all that upfront risk assessment and continuous auditing and project evaluation, so you can course correct. I mean, doing a postmortem at the end of the project and then, oh, the goals weren't met, that is really not efficient, right? Because the money's already been spent. I think more the upfront risk assessment and essentially course correcting and the continuous auditing, I think would help, at least in terms of the money flows. Of course, there are other project objectives as well, but again, curious to hear from the others.
I would toss one little brick on the wagon here and say auditing, and Shruti, I agree with you completely, auditing is important. This won't be a surprise to you. However, technology gives you real time. Let's not set it, forget it, and study it later. Let's use technology to understand what's happening today and fix it while it's happening. This is what industry does. The government needs to do it. It's our dollars, our taxpayer dollars. The government should do what industry does, period. There's no excuse not to. And I think the other thing I'd say is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So if we're hoping everything is going to go fine and audit later and think that's going to work, we have to avail ourselves of what industry knows here. And Alex, I would plead with you and your colleagues to sort of form some group that makes it easy for people who understand what's really going on in industry and how it works to come in and say, look, this is what should happen now. You need the data now. The mistakes are going to get made in the first year of this program that will set the course for EVs for 10 years. $7 billion of mistakes or not decided in year one on data. Let's do it right. It's for the planet. It's not just infrastructure. It's the planet. Okay. This is greenhouse gas, climate change. Okay. I'm done.
Alex, as you are single-handedly fixing Congress.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, problem.
This is just my day job, Beth. So
I think the other question in terms of the performance of this program, how do we prevent what the Georgetown Climate Center fears that the overall infrastructure that we build drives greenhouse gases up while we're electrifying?
And I hope Beth puts this in the chat so folks can see, but Beth's organization did a great blog post. And this goes back to what I was talking about, policy choices. So, it's a state-based system. States are going to choose the projects. Georgetown Law did a great graph of, what are the impacts of the policy choices. So if we decide to actually fix our infrastructure, so replace existing bridges, repave our roads, invest in better transit and biking and walking options, this historic funding can actually decrease climate emissions as, I think one of the goals of the law. If we actually use that funding to not repair existing infrastructure, but to widen highways and build new ones, the Georgetown Law Climate Center has actually found that even if we make all these amazing investments in transit, biking and walking, overall emissions will go up. So I think it goes back to the first point of, whether it's you spending money, a business spending money, or federal government spending money, that is a policy choice. And so we need to be making the right ones. And so part of that is setting goals. So in the areas where we do have goals, like electric vehicle charging or replacing lead pipes, I think the oversight, as Shruti was alluding to, is making sure that we are meeting the goals effectively. We're getting it up, right up front, like Larry said, with the right design thing. We're listening to folks like Larry to make sure that, Congress is providing effective oversight. In areas where we don't have goals, that's obviously a lot bigger challenge. And unfortunately, that is most of our highway program. I think that's where the federal government needs to, step in and try to encourage, and as far as their statutory allows, start to set some of those goals, right? So start to say, hey, states, let's actually replace bridges before, building new ones. Let's actually repave roads before widening highways. Let's actually address safety by making it safer for folks to bike and walk, make sure we're doing those things. So I think, that's where we need to start in areas that don't have those objectives. Is actually starting to, and we haven't done that for 66 years. But as I said, the future doesn't have to be the past, and we can choose to change that. And so I hope we would, especially in the area of our transportation program, where we haven't done that yet. And I think we're paying some of those consequences because of the bad policy choices we've made.
Well, there we go. So I think we probably could have talked for a lot longer and on many other aspects of this. We're going to close up now. I'm going to hand things over to Parker Feldman to do that.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Parker Feldman. I am the Symposium editor for the Law Review. I just want to thank you all so much for joining us today to hear from this wonderful panel about oversight, infrastructure, and federalism. And thank you to the panelists for sharing their views and research into a variety of topics. And thank you to our wonderful moderator, of course, for asking fantastic questions and keeping this entire process running, I guess, as smoothly as it could go. The overarching theme of this symposium is how federalism interacts with efforts to ensure adequate oversight of our infrastructure investments. And this is oversight that is directed at weeding out waste, fraud, and abuse, as well as efforts to ensure that our stated goals of these policies and the oversight investments are actually being delivered upon. So as we heard today, these policies are delivered through federal, state, local, and private actors. And what we're aiming to discuss between the two panels today is a high-level understanding and discussion as to these mechanisms of oversight and how they are built into the law and policies themselves. So this first wonderful panel this morning focused on the mechanisms in place, or the mechanisms that would need to be in place to adequately provide oversight and carry out the policy goals stated in infrastructure legislation. So we heard from Alex Beckman, who discussed various transportation and infrastructure issues. He taught us about how the infrastructure transportation system is state-based and discussed the various complications that this setup can bring about when attempting to provide adequate oversight of transportation infrastructure. We heard from Larry, who discussed the funding that Congress has appropriated to build out the electrification of the existing infrastructure to bring the country from a fossil fuel-based system to an electrified system. Through his discussion, Larry identified how Congress can oversee these billions of dollars going towards electric vehicle charging infrastructure and what mechanisms could be put in place so that waste, fraud, and abuse can be adequately avoided. And finally, we heard from Shruti Shah, who discussed the Coalition for Integrity and the very important role that they play in combating corruption in business and government. Shruti offered many suggestions towards avoiding types of fraud in infrastructure programs, including having a public website displaying infrastructure spending for various projects that would provide transparency to the public and hold individuals charged with carrying out these projects accountable for their actions. So our next panel this afternoon focuses on looking at the performance of infrastructure projects and how well oversight operates closer to the ground in a project-based system. So our second wonderful panel will start this afternoon at 2 p.m. You're not going to want to miss it. Thanks again to our panelists and our moderator, and to everyone who attended. I hope that you all get a chance to attend the next panel. And with that, I think we are wrapped up.